Hey, Soul Church. I just wanted to share a couple things about this upcoming Sunday. Hopefully, you're going to be getting together with your missional community. As you get together with your missional community, Rob has communicated with the MC leaders some ideas for liturgy and for some singing. And we're going to start discussing the book of Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew. And the subtitle of our sermon series is going to be The Son of David, the Son of Abraham. So we're going to work through the book of Matthew. Hopefully, eventually, we're gathering together again. It'll be a normal sermon series. Until then, we're going to do it in MC. So I want to just introduce the series, introduce the Gospel according to Matthew, and walk through a few items there. Okay, so let's jump into a quick introduction to the Gospel according to Matthew. Okay, so the Gospel according to Matthew, we're going to look at a few specific things. We're going to work through it chapter by chapter. We're going to take chapter 5 and take a few Sundays on that one. And there's a couple places where we're going to combine two chapters together. But for the most part, it's going to be chapter by chapter, looking at them as story units. So a few things we want to highlight as we get into the Gospel according to Matthew. One, Matthew is going to announce not just the culmination of the true story, but also a new beginning in Jesus. So we're going to talk more about what it means for Jesus to be the son of Abraham and the son of David. But one of the things that it means is that the story is continuing, but it's also a new beginning to the story. Here we have a transcendent figure carrying the story on to a place that it hasn't been yet. Two, we want to see the inauguration of the kingdom in Jesus' ministry. Here we see a lot of the continuation of the Davidic kingdom and what it means for Jesus to be the son of David. We want to show the sacrifice of Christ as the means of inaugurating and spreading the kingdom. We'll talk more about that and how it relates to Jesus as the son of Abraham. And it's also going to work as a continuation of our study in politics. We've been talking about the kingdom and the nation. We had Michael Ware come and share a kingdom worldview. We had some sessions on immigration. We hope to continue that, and we're going to figure out the best way to do that in the coming months. But Matthew works really well. Stanley Hauerwas, in his commentary on Matthew, says this: Matthew's gospel is about the politics of Jesus, which entails an alternative to the power politics of the world. The politics of Jesus, moreover, entails not only the politics in the gospel, but also the politics of reading the gospel. A right reading of the gospel requires a people who are shaped by the oblation familiar to the faithful. That is, a community whose fundamental political act is the sacrifice of the altar, an alternative to Herodian power politics. A theological reading of Matthew therefore reaffirms that the church be an alternative politics to the politics of the world. So we're going to talk about, how reading through Matthew, thinking about the kingdom, reading the Sermon on the Mount, reading Jesus' ministry, how it is a different form of using power. And we know that politics very often is about power. So how does that affect our political thinking? So as we look at the Gospel according to Matthew, there's a few things that I want you to pay attention to. And the first is that it's actually a narrative. It's a story. There's a book called The Gospel as Stories, which I'll highlight as we go through this series, which has been super, super helpful. And it analyzes what's called narrative theology or narrative criticism. And it looks at it as a story. Like, how does this work as a story? And there's some main things whenever we think of a story. There's some core items that we think of. So the first one would be a setting. Okay, where does the story take place? So we know that Matthew, the gospel, the story of Jesus takes place in Israel, but Matthew actually uses geography in interesting ways, where Jesus is going to start his ministry up north in Israel, in Galilee, and then eventually his ministry is going to culminate down south in Jerusalem. All right. We tend to think of the nation of Israel fairly monolithically, but it actually was really diverse, especially when you separated the north and the south. So think, like the difference between a Midwestern small town and, a coastal metropolis, right? It would be like, the cultural difference from, some old TV shows like the Beverly Hillbillies, where, you have these rednecks that go to Beverly Hills, or the one I remember from my youth was Crockett Crocodile Dundee, right? Here's this guy who was in the outback and just part of that culture, being brought into New York City, and now he's completely out of place, walking around with his crocodile skin and his massive knife. My kids reminded me of Elf, which is kind of the extreme of this, right? Where he is enculturated into the North Pole and Santa's workshop, and he finds himself in New York City. He just doesn't quite fit in. To a certain extent, that's kind of the difference between somebody from Galilee and somebody from Jerusalem, all right, or Judea. If you were to talk to someone from the South, a lot of times immediately you can tell, oh, you're not from around here. If you're in New York City and you hear a Midwestern accent, it's fairly obvious that you're not from around here. And a lot of times we make assumptions based on that, right? Like several years ago, growing up, we had a president who came from Arkansas, and usually, political power you see in the coastal elites, and it's like, really, this guy, governor of Arkansas, is going to be the president of the United States? We make these assumptions, right? So keep that in mind, like as Jesus is moving from Galilee, where he grew up. And remember, somebody at one point says, can anything good come out of Nazareth, which is in Galilee, right? And anything good going to come out of there? As soon as he gets to Jerusalem, everybody knows he's not from there. Okay, everybody knows that he's not part of the Jerusalem culture. From his accent to even probably the way he dressed, all of that, he was likely perceived as an outsider. So keep that in mind. Matthew uses geography of Jesus moving from the north to the south, and it's not just incidental. There's some very important cultural things that are happening there. Then we also see, not just the setting, but the characters. What characters is the author going to use to emphasize their point, right? What characters is the author going to focus on, and how is he going to do that? So we're going to see this whole cast of characters, and different gospels use different characters in different stories. So Jesus is the primary character, but we're going to see a lot of like his interaction with John the Baptist, his interaction with religious leaders, his interaction with Gentiles, and all of those things are building a story, building something about Jesus that we're supposed to know. So besides setting and characters, the last thing we want to pay attention to is plot. Okay, so the plot is like the storyline. The story is the narrative that an author puts together to build to a climax and then fade to a resolution, right? And different authors, even if they're telling the same essential story, are going to include different elements and tell the story a little bit differently. So as an example, I enjoyed the movie about Steve Jobs. There's been several movies about Steve Jobs. There's like Pirates of Silicon Valley, there's Jobs, and then there's Steve Jobs. And they're all telling essentially kind of the same story about this man who, created all the devices that, we use nowadays. But all of them do it really different. Like Pirates of Silicon Valley is about like this whole cast of characters that are kind of bringing about modern computing. Where Steve Jobs, he tells three stories. The introduction of the Mac, the introduction of the next computer, and then the introduction of the iMac, right? And he frames his story around Steve introducing these devices at these big events, and then interacting with the people around him. And there's specific characters that Aaron Sorkin and Danny Boyle include in this movie, and specific ones that they leave out. And they're trying to paint a picture of Steve Jobs by his interaction with his assistant, with Steve Wozniak, with his daughter. But it all revolves around these three events. All right. If you think about it biographically, it seems like telling just three events isn't going to help you learn a lot about a person. But if it's done well, you get a flavor for the person that maybe if you try to tell as many little stories as you could, you might miss out on some of that. So all the gospel writers are doing things a little bit differently, emphasizing slightly different things, right? We've got the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which read as if they're based on the same source material. And then John's kind of doing his own thing. We studied John about a year ago. But Matthew is including specific stories, specific characters, building to a specific climax and then resolving it, right? And so I want you to pay attention, to the stories that Matthew tells, and the way that they're arranged. So don't think in terms of like simple biography where you're supposed to read this as this is exactly what happened. Somebody's just narrating the events as they happened in the order that they happened. That's not what's happening here. Matthew is collecting all of these stories and oral traditions about Jesus, and he's putting them together in a narrative way. So when you think about like the Sermon on the Mount, it's actually unlikely that Jesus got up at one time and gave this whole long sermon where it included everything that Matthew says that he said. It's likely that Matthew pulled together a lot of the oral tradition about Jesus, a lot of the common stories, and put them together as a unified whole. Right? So pay attention to the plot, pay attention to what Matthew is doing as we work through it. What stories is he including? Why does he include each story? And how is he building towards the climax? Okay? So that's what we're going to start studying. We're going to get into chapter 1, not next week. Next week we're going to be together at the park again, but the following week we'll get into chapter 1. We're providing some resources for every MC leader to help lead some of these discussions. We're using Matthew by Stanley Hauerwas. Really excited for this book. It's a theological commentary on the Gospel according to Matthew. And then we'll be using some Matthew for Everyone by N.T. Wright. So we'll include discussion questions just so you know, a lot of times they won't be original to me. I'll try to make sure I give credit where it's due, but a lot of them will be coming from N.T. Wright. Okay, so what I'd love for you to do with your MCs, if you're listening to this the day before, if you're listening to this on a Sunday with your MC, a couple questions for discussion. So first off, if you were to write a story of Jesus' life, what would you include? What are the elements that you would include? What are some maybe parables or examples, conversations that stand out to you that you would include in there? And what would be the climax of your story? Where would your story climax if you were telling that? And then how would it resolve itself? And then the second question that I'd love for you to discuss is, what does it mean that Jesus is the son of David? And then what does it mean that Jesus is the son of Abraham? I mentioned that a little bit right at the beginning, but take some time and think about what does it mean for him to be, for Matthew to open his book with, he says it this way, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Right there, he's framing it in this way. So what is Matthew trying to communicate when he says the son of David, the son of Abraham? Let's get some ideas out there. What are we thinking? We'll talk more about it as we dig into chapter 1 in 2 weeks. All right. Thanks so much. Looking forward to seeing you again, gathering again all together, hopefully in a couple weeks or months.